Mhm. Hi people, Mariënburg here again. This is going to be the second video on the series called Story Times, simply scary stories about occult and paranormal happenings locally in Suriname. I might do a general one maybe somewhere down the line or down the road, but for now I'm sticking to the basics. Yesterday I covered the first video called of a phenomenon of forest spirit here locally called the Fantasy. That's what it's called locally, but as far as I know, it should be present practically anywhere where there's a tropical climate, or even in areas with a colder climate, you name it. So globally, but I'm talking about local lore, of course. The story, in any case, that I'm going to cover today is taken from a book by a local person that has already deceased, someone, so basically a late writer. Called Ronald Haselhoef. It's not someone that you'll know. Not even local people seem to know him. In any case, he was one of the cheap laborers, basically one of these so-called modern slaves back in colonial time that worked under Dutch rule. And he was of a mixed race. So back in the day, you had a lot of these, a ton of these paranormal and occult happenings back in the day when there was no electricity. So you had to be inside after sunset because you had a lot, not just for that reason, but one of the reasons is that you had a lot of malevolent entities that roamed the streets at night, if you will, due to the fact that there was no light, no electricity, there was no public lighting, there were no electricity poles or lighting poles out on the street. There was nothing, there was no street lighting and so on. So when walking on the street, you literally couldn't see a single thing unless you brought the light with you, but it was like trekking through the darkness. It's like during a total blackout, you literally can't even see your own hand. In any case, the story that I'm going to read for you is from his book called Strange Things or Paranormal Happenings from Mariënburg. Mariënburg, spelled M-A-R-I-E-N-B-U-R-G, is simply a former plantation here. It's one of the most profitable, it was one of the most profitable plantations for the Dutch back in colonial times. And yeah, they primarily exported sugar canes. They processed sugar canes into sugar and then they exported it to the Netherlands. In any case, this story is called, keep in mind that everything is in Dutch, so you have to excuse me if I pause sometimes in order to translate it as appropriately or as properly as possible, as well as the fact that the story is pretty much bare bone. You know, they didn't do too much of a job in terms of editing it properly, so there might be some baggage here and there. I'll try to minimize the baggage, but the story is 4 or 5 pages, so it's going to take a short while, so to speak, to get to the point. In any case, the header is Mr. Badri and the Wallapa fish of the Pauluscreek. And yeah, just let me read for you. We worked until noon on Saturday because after that it was payday for people that work fortnight. This was quite a happening on the plantation. All of the workers came together one by one and they had their names called out, and then they walked up full of pride and they received their weekly or their bi-monthly income. And the salary that we received was of such a nature that you had to work a part-time job in the weekend because we didn't get paid a lot. We also had an extra activity. One person planted, so basically one person committed to some farming on a small level or on a small scale, and the other one simply sold off vegetables from that same undertaking, and so on and so forth. I also knew a man. His name was Mr. Badri. Badri is a common name here for example, for Indians, so Hindu. The family Badri, B-A-D-R-I-E, is a common Indian name, at the very least locally. He worked as a gardener for the Dutch in their clubhouse as well as their immediate vicinity. That's where he maintained the roses, he trimmed the hedges, etc. He himself did not make a lot of money, so he was also forced to hustle here and there in order to maintain himself financially. And throughout the years, he especially focused on catching fish, and specifically on swamp fishes, specifically the walapa. Walapa is spelled W-A-L-A-P-A. It's a common swamp fish here, and it's said to be very delicious. I can't remember eating it, but yeah. He caught these fish in creeks, in swamps, and in rivers behind the plantation. He carried them home in bags and so on, and he sold them the following day or the following weekend after bringing them into town. Unfortunately for him, he was not the only one that used fish as a means of hustling, or catching as well as selling fish as a means of hustle. He had to endure quite a good deal of competition, and that meant that he could not access the usual creeks and trenches he was used to accessing due to the strong competition. So basically, this guy, Mr. Badri, he wasn't able to make use of the usual fishing spots that he made use of simply due to the fact that he had competition, and all the others also came to fish and make use of the same areas he made use of for catching fish. So basically, Mr. Badri was looking for places that were far away, that his competitors had not yet discovered, or those that were so far that the average person would definitely not even think multiple times about going there. By applying this technique, he came to a creek called the Pauluscreek. Paulus is a common Dutch name too. Okay, it's more a name for religious figures. For example, a priest is called Paulus. That's how it's pronounced in Dutch. It's basically the equivalent of Paul, but it's pronounced P-A-U-L-U-S, so with U-S at the end instead of just Paul. I went with him a couple of times. It was basically 10 to 20 kilometers removed from the sugar plantation, Mariënburg. And going over there was easy, but coming back was a nightmare. It was not easy to carry bags full of fish from that distance. Hold on, I'm just skipping past the baggage. Mr. Badri discovered a part of the creek where it came out into a swamp that was completely covered with a large density of vegetation and a lot of lily flowers and lily plants inside the swamp. You could eat the plants were so thick, the vegetation was so thick along with those lily plants and flowers that you could easily walk over them. So you were basically walking on these plants themselves in order to not fall into the swamp. You did have to walk careful though, and not make any sudden movements or hefty movements, because it would start rattling the same way that a waterbed were to rattle. And so this Indian fisherman discovered a part of the creek which came out into a swamp, and the thing is that swamp was so thick in terms of being covered with vegetation. It was so thick and densely covered in vegetation that you could easily walk onto the vegetation itself, specifically these lily plants that you commonly come across in swamps and rivers. But they were so thick that you could walk on them, and it was like walking on water, similar to walking on a waterbed. But you had to not make any false movements. The thing is that there were thousands upon thousands of fish that were protected in the water, and due to the thick and dense vegetation, sunlight rarely got through. So a tactic that we applied was that we were to remove a couple of lily flowers or lily plants, a couple of vegetation, a couple of pieces of vegetation, and solar rays during the day or in the morning time would seep through into the water, and these fish would be so spooked from it that they would immediately jump out of the water, similar to the way that flying fish jump out of the water. And it was like the technique that Eskimos used to fish by drilling a circular hole in a river or a creek that was covered in a layer of ice on top. So that's the tactic that they applied. And yeah, Mr. Badri really enjoyed himself, and he caught a lot of fish that were excessively big, etc. And what he used to do is that he also when bringing them home, he used to empty them into a barrel or a vat. That's pronounced VAT. Vat is basically the Dutch equivalent for barrel. And yeah, the technique that this Indian fisherman, Mr. Badri, applied was that he was, after catching all of these walapa fish, these swamp fish, he simply emptied them when he came home into a vat filled with water, just to preserve them at least temporarily until he were to clean them and then take them into the center of town to have them sold off. The majority were usually already dead, but sometimes a couple of them still survived, even when it was time to clean them and kill them. Yeah. Etc. For the rest, there's a lot of baggage. A night after a successful catching of fish again, a successful day of catching fish, Mr. Badri heard, when he was sleeping late at night or in the morning time, even around 3 or 4 a.m., he heard a faint crying for help. It was like he heard someone say, help me, please, I want to go back. And he tried to trace where the sound came from. The sound was very faint and soft, but he still managed to track it down, and to his surprise, it came out of a vat in which he had emptied these fish. And when he opened that barrel, he could not believe what he saw. There was one fish specifically that was begging for help. That fish had the ability, for whatever reason, to talk or to speak, and told him, please, I want to go back to the swamp. Please take me back. And he was startled and couldn't move for a second, but he snapped out of it at a certain point and went to get a bucket of water and tried to keep that fish alive as long as he possibly could, but to no avail, because when the sun came up, when the sun rose that morning, that fish that spoke to him was already dead. And his wife came to look for him, and she found him outside, so Mr. Badri's wife, and he told her what happened, and she warned him. She told him that she already warned him multiple times to not go near that swamp because she had nightmares about that swamp ever since he started going to it. So basically the fisherman's wife told him that she had nightmares about the swamp after he told her what happened, that fish spoke to him and that fish still died. And she told him that ever since he started fishing at that swamp heavily, just to gain an edge on the competition, that she had nightmares about that place. She had dreamt about that place multiple times in a negative light, and she warned him to not go fish there anymore. But yeah, of course he didn't listen to her. He simply was too blinded by the excessive success that he had in catching fish there. And yeah, that's pretty much the essence of the story. For the rest, the story just goes on to say that Mr. Badri, the fisherman, slowly went insane. They tried everything to help him. When regular medical practices did not work, they had him admitted into a local asylum. So the nut house, if you will. Locally, there is only one asylum for the mentally ill, and it still exists to this day under a different name, albeit. And yeah, that's where that fisherman ended up. The writer goes on to state that, the fisherman became completely apathetic, along the lines of, if he were to look at you, his eyes would be completely glazed over, and the only thing that he could mumble was, "It's all my fault. I killed her. I should have never taken her out of the swamp." That's all that he could stammer. That's all that he could muster to recite over and over again. And yeah, he just slowly lost it. He became mentally ill, and he just bluntly lost his mind. He ended up in the mental asylum, and the writer says after a couple of years he never saw him again. And the thing is too that after that happened, he went to that swamp, and he saw a sailboat there that had keeled over, something that was not noticeable beforehand when he briefly went with the fisherman. After just one time, he said that he didn't notice it because he only went briefly with that fisherman, but he didn't look around. He was too focused on catching fish. But after this happened, he took a look around the entire swamp, and he saw a sailboat, those sailboats that have two sails or two sail masts, kind of like those yachts, if you will. And the reason that he hadn't noticed it when he went the first time is because it was so densely covered in vegetation, and they tried everything to help the fishermen. They even tried using shamans and seers, because they knew that, hey, people started talking and saying that the cause of his illness, the fact that he's mentally ill and that he went insane, is not rational. Something happened to him. He was possessed, or he is still possessed by a malevolent entity, or something happened. But in any case, there's some evil force at work. There's some malevolent force at work here. But yeah, multiple occultists and shamans tried to help him, and to no avail. He did make some brief progress, the fisherman, but that's it. And yeah, the writer of the story, Ronald, he himself says that he discovered that they like to call it in Dutch a two-master. That's because of the two masts that are used to erect sails. They're usually those white sailboats, just a mini yacht, if you will. It's just a yacht. And the conclusion that he could come to, what is the most likeliest of situations that occur, is that yacht sailed from the river or from the Atlantic Ocean inwards or inlands, and ended up stranded in the creek. And most likely there was a female passenger on board that died, since the fish that spoke had a female voice. And that woman died for whatever reason. She either couldn't find her way out of the creek, or out of the jungle, or out of the swamp, or she just died of starvation and exposure, or she succumbed to her injuries, and her spirit started drifting around that swamp. And as a result, after time or after a while, she automatically attached herself to the swamp as a whole, and that includes the fish. And Mr. Badley, the fisherman, made a mistake of fishing too much there, or catching too much fish there, and slowly but surely he started draining the life energy of that dead woman that was still haunting that swamp. And until he literally went a fish too far, and he basically caught the last remnants of that woman. And that woman, that's why she manifested as a fish, and she asked him, she manifested as one of the fish, the last fish that he caught, and she asked him to bring him back to the swamp with her dying breath. And due to the intensity of what happened, that dead woman also drove him insane. So yeah, that's basically the story. So in essence here we have simply a situation where, keep in mind, this is all true. This is all confirmed true. This is a true story. This happened in 1950 or something locally. Most of the stories that the author mentioned in this book are written in 1950 and so on. Let's just say 25 years before the country gained its independence. And yeah, you had a lot of stuff like this happening, but this is one of my favorite stories because I managed to locate that creek geographically. I'm not saying that I that I'm gonna go to it, but I would still like to check it out to see if that dead woman is still there, because my own brief research has pointed out that that woman is still there and that she still haunts the creek. The Pauluscreek still exists. It's simply a side branch of the Surinamese River, and in any case, back then it was a lot. I think it's still, that creek is still in the same. It's still covered in dense and thick vegetation and so on, and no one goes there. But yeah, that's the essence of basically what happened. That's also the reason for why it was such. It was that swamp had so many fish. Usually, when a place is haunted in a positive way, when an entity attaches itself to a certain location, and it relies on that location, it feeds extra life energy, which causes the environment to glow in an unusual way, or to be fertile in an excessively unusual way. And in this case, that's what made these fish extra big. That dead woman made these fish extra big. And it was most likely, a Dutch colonial party that either got lost in the Atlantic Ocean or was simply sailing from the Netherlands to Suriname, and they got lost somewhere alongside the Surinamese River. The Atlantic Ocean, when coming deeper inland, flows into the Surinamese River, and then you have a bunch of side branches, and they got lost somewhere and they ended up in that swamp, and I think the rest of the crew just died, or maybe that woman was just alone, but bottom line is that there was a woman and she died in whatever way she died. She was unable to find her way out of, her ship simply got shipwrecked, and she was unable to find her way out of that swamp, and she simply died there, and she kept lingering and hanging around. Her spirit kept lingering and hanging around her astral body. And it attached itself as the years went by, because no one goes there. That place is completely isolated, and it's a jungle, swamp-like landscape, and no person would even think about going there, not even hunters and fishermen nowadays, because it's too deeply inland. Okay, like I said, it's a swamp. I think it's at least, 50 kilometers, and 50 kilometers going through a densely vegetated area, even with a general boat, a speedboat, or a boat with an exterior motor, is not doable. It's very, very difficult. So yeah, you can bet that no one ever went near that place. But yeah, this unlucky fisherman, this Indian fisherman, simply wanted to gain an edge on the competition. Even nowadays, it's simply a struggle to get by for local people, and they'll do anything, almost anything, to hustle left and right just to make some extra pocket money. And that was also the case for him. But he simply barked up the wrong tree, so to speak. He went to this swamp, and he saw that it was a tremendous catch, and that he's the only one that knows the location of the swamp. His competition isn't familiar with the swamp, and he simply caught fish. He caught buckets of fish day after day, fish that people were clamoring him for. Okay, people were begging him for the fish, and everyone. He enjoyed a good reputation alongside the fact that hey, Mr. Badri's fish are the best fish in town. His fish are tremendously big. I have no idea where he gets them from. His competition has smaller fishes in stock, and blah blah blah. And he went too far, because he drained the life energy of the dead woman that inhabited that swamp with each catch, until he went too far. He literally went a fish too far, and that dead woman simply begged him to bring her back to the swamp. And by bring her back, simply the fish that spoke to him itself. But it was too late, and that fish died soon afterwards. That's why that voice was also so weak and so frail. And he basically heard something equivalent to, "Please bring me back, please." The same way that someone with his or her last dying breath would talk to you in a gasping way. And he went insane. As a result of that, he went insane. That dead woman made him go insane, obviously, because it's simply an act of revenge. You take me out of the swamp, and I'll damage you mentally so badly that you'll never be the same again. That's also I know local shaman or healer, spiritual healer was able to help him. So yeah, it was only after the author went there that he discovered everything and that he really took a look at everything, and he closes off the story by saying that after that happened, he, as well as the one or two people that he told about that swamp, never went to the swamp again. They never went again. And like I said, this story especially interested me. There's just something about it that intrigues me. I mean, everything occult-wise intrigues me, but this story intrigues me to the point where I almost want to go into that swamp, and I've already confirmed for myself more or less that that dead woman is still there. You know, she's still haunting that swamp, so you'll still find loads of fish, and I'll still find that sailboat that's completely covered. And who knows, if I go into that sailboat, I might see her dead body, you know, obviously her bones, her skeleton, because I mean, her body has already decayed a long time ago. I mean, this is like what, 60 years ago? This is half a century ago. But yeah, I don't intend on doing that because it would be like an archaeological expedition, and like I said, nowadays even the place is completely overgrown. I managed to find it on Google Maps because I didn't even know where the Pauluscreek was. It took me some digging, but I found out where that creek was, and I took a look, and yeah, like I said, it's a side branch of the Surinamese River, and it's really deeply inlands or inwards. It's like 80 kilometers or something, converted into kilometers. So even if you were to be able to find a boatsman with an exterior motor that is willing to go with you, or a hunting party, or just an expedition party, an expeditional party, it's going to be ridiculously difficult because you can only go so far. Roughly estimated, I think at most I can go half the distance, 40 kilometers. After that, the area will simply be too densely vegetated for an exterior motor to penetrate through. So the only other option would be to traverse that swamp by foot or on foot, and you know, one should also be wary of wild animals like caimans and snakes and a bunch of annoying bugs that infest the place. But yeah, it would theoretically speaking be ridiculously interesting for me if I could just discover that swamp, because it's a swamp, so there's bound to be other wildlife there. There are bound to be a ton of snakes there and other annoying animals that I don't want to come into contact with. But I'm just saying, hypothetically speaking, this would be really interesting. And yeah, the lesson that you can learn, so to speak, from this story is that, yeah, this happens sometimes. It's not the first time that I've heard it. When someone dies, that they attach themselves to their location. For example, someone dies at sea, and that person haunts the immediate vicinity, everything within a radius of, 25 meters. And it affects the flora as well as the fauna. It affects the entire landscape that it is inhabiting, that person or creature is inhabiting, as well as the wildlife within said direct vicinity. But yeah, in that woman's case, she simply is unable to move on. She might move on, or she will move on eventually, I think, from her grief. I think she can't get over the fact that she simply was stranded there and she died in no man's land without anyone knowing where she is, family not knowing where she is. She never saw her family again, and that prevents her from moving on into the afterlife and finding peace and rest. So she continuously haunts the entire place and feeds off of the environment, and also feeds the environment for self-sustenance with life energy, like I mentioned, with astral energy specifically. But yeah, that's the essence of the story, and I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next installment, the third video. This was the second one. Bye.